They thought they could harass a helpless family until a truck pulled in and Sylvester Stallone stepped out. The Harrisons, a middle-class family from Cleveland, had been on the road for hours. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the endless stretch of highway. The car hummed steadily, the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt a comforting companion. John Harrison, the father, adjusted the rearview mirror, glancing back at his wife, Lisa, and their two children, Emily and James. They were all tired but in good spirits, enjoying the freedom of the open road. The summer vacation was exactly what they needed. Take a second to subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Now back to the story. How about we stop for a break? John suggested, his voice steady but tired. Lisa nodded, looking out the window at the landscape rolling by. Sound good. Let's stretch our legs. Up ahead, a small, run-down gas station came into view. The faded sign read, "The Last Stop," in chipped red paint. It was the kind of place they could use to refuel both the car and themselves. A single pump stood under a rusting canopy, and a couple of old trucks were parked nearby. The station seemed quiet, almost forgotten by time. John pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. Emily and James immediately began to squirm, excited at the prospect of a quick stretch. "Be careful, okay?" Lisa reminded them, looking out the window toward the dilapidated store. "Yes, Mom," they both chimed in unison, eager to get out of the car. John parked near the pumps, turning off the engine. As he stepped out of the car, the heat of the afternoon sun hit him. The air was thick, humid, and the smell of gasoline lingered in the air. He walked over to the pump, grabbing the nozzle and clicking it into place. Lisa stretched her arms, gazing at the quiet scene. A few birds chirped from a nearby tree, and there was a faint breeze that stirred the dusty parking lot. It was peaceful for now. What they didn't know was that this simple stop would soon take a dangerous turn. As John finished fueling the car, a loud engine roar interrupted the calm. A rusty pickup truck screeched into the lot, its tires skidding slightly as it parked with a jarring thud. The truck's grill was covered in mud, and its windows were tinted dark, obscuring the driver's face. The engine sputtered and died, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The truck's door slammed open, and four men, all in their 30s or early 40s, stepped out. Their clothes were worn, stained, and their faces set in hard lines that spoke of years of trouble. The leader of the group, a stocky man with a grizzled beard, was the first to notice the Harrisons. He locked eyes with John, sizing him up as if measuring some unspoken threat. He sneered, tipping his baseball cap back slightly, revealing a face that had clearly spent more time in bars than in sunlight. "Well, look what we got here," the man said with a gravelly voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A couple of city folk out here in the middle of nowhere." His eyes lingered on Lisa, then James and Emily. He chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down John's spine. "Don't mind us," John replied, trying to keep the tone casual. He reached for his wallet, his fingers tense. "Just making a quick stop." The man ignored the attempt at civility and stepped closer, blocking John's path. His friends flanked him, smirking as they exchanged glances. John could feel the heat of the moment growing. Emily clung to her mother, while James shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. One of the other men, tall and lanky, leaned against a nearby post, his eyes scanning the family, a sneer on his lips. "What? You don't like the look of us?" he asked mockingly. John glanced back at Lisa, who was already looking worried. The tension in the air was palpable. What had started as a peaceful stop was quickly turning into something far more threatening. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the heat of the afternoon sun now feeling oppressive. John could feel the pressure mounting, the men circling like predators sizing up their prey. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady as he glanced at Lisa, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the group. "You guys need something?" John asked, his tone firm but controlled. "We're just passing through." The stocky man, the leader, took a slow step forward, the others following suit. He grinned, a cruel twist of his lips. "Just a little friendly chat. You know, I don't see too many folks like you around here." His eyes flicked again to Lisa, and the look was unmistakably lecherous. Maybe we're not so different after all. John's chest tightened. He was used to confrontations, but this felt different. The man wasn't just harassing them. There was a venom behind his words, something darker. Come on, guys. One of the others chimed in, a tall, scruffy man with a cigarette dangling from his lips. Let's have some fun. He sneered at Emily and James, who were still huddled together in the car, their wide eyes staring out the window. John's fists clenched at his sides. Leave them out of it, he said, his voice a little sharper now. But the stocky man wasn't backing down. He leaned in, his breath smelling of alcohol, his voice low and mocking. What's wrong? You afraid of a little fun? Or are you just too soft to handle it? The men chuckled amongst themselves, and John's heart raced as the tension thickened. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the scrutiny, as they tried to provoke him further. His body was on alert, every muscle tight, ready to react if this went further. Rick, the leader, stood just a few feet away now, smirking. I think we've got ourselves a real tough guy here, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Let's see how tough you really are. John's mind raced. He couldn't back down, but he couldn't let this spiral out of control. The last thing he wanted was a fight, but it seemed like that was exactly where this was heading. The air hung thick with tension as Rick took another step forward, his eyes glinting with malice. John could feel the heat of the man's gaze, the weight of his challenge, but he held his ground. You don't know what you're dealing with, John said, trying to defuse the situation. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his throat, a warning that if things escalated, it would not end well. Rick laughed, a low, mocking sound that sent a chill down John's spine. Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with, he sneered, glancing at his friends, who were beginning to circle around the Harrison family like vultures. You think you're tough, huh? Just because you got a nice car and a pretty family? You're just like all the rest. Soft, scared of what's real. John's heart began to race. He could feel the anger rising in him, the urge to stand up to this man, but he knew better than to let the rage take over. He needed to keep his cool for his family, for their safety. Rick stepped closer, now almost chest to chest with John. You think you can hide behind your family? Rick taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. What kind of man lets his wife and kids take the heat for him? The words stung, and John's fists clenched involuntarily. Rick saw the shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, and a sick grin spread across his face. He could feel the power he had over the situation, the control he was gaining. He turned to the other men, giving a dismissive wave. Watch this, he said before turning back to John, his voice rising. Why don't you stand up and show me how tough you really are? You want to be a hero so bad. Why don't you come take me on? The challenge was clear. The group watched, their eyes eager, anticipating what would happen next. John's heart hammered in his chest, but he refused to give Rick the satisfaction of seeing him back down. The situation was on the verge of erupting, and it was clear that Rick wasn't going to let it go without a fight. John stood motionless, the words from Rick hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The tension had reached its boiling point, and he knew the next move would decide everything. Rick's smirk was wide, confident. He was daring John to react, hoping to provoke him into making a mistake. John could feel his heartbeat pulsing in his ears, but he didn't let it show. His eyes flicked to Lisa, whose face was etched with worry, then to the kids in the car, their innocent faces wide with fear. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about proving something to Rick or anyone else. It was about keeping his family safe. Rick was still inches away, his chest puffed out in false bravado. The rest of his gang stood behind him, their presence more threatening now, feeding off the leader's aggression. They waited, eager for something to happen, knowing they had the upper hand. But John didn't give them the satisfaction. Move on, John said quietly, his voice calm but firm. This doesn't have to go any further. Rick laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. What? You think you're going to talk your way out of this? You think you could just stand there and scare me off? He leaned in closer, his breath hot and rancid. You're just a soft little city guy who thinks he's tough. John's hands remained at his sides, fists unclenched but ready if needed. I'm not looking for a fight, he said, trying to stay as composed as possible. But I won't let you hurt my family. The words hung in the air, challenging Rick's bravado, but Rick didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward again, this time raising his voice. "You're a coward," he spat. "What kind of man stands there, letting his family take the heat for him? If you're not going to fight, then get out of the way." John's jaw tightened. He could feel the pressure building, the air thick with hostility. He didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Rick's with unyielding resolve. The standoff had reached its peak. Just as the tension reached its peak, a loud engine rumbled in the distance, cutting through the standoff like a knife. The sound grew louder, and all eyes turned toward the source of the noise. A black truck roared into the lot, its tires kicking up gravel as it slid to a stop. The engine sputtered to silence, and the door swung open with a definitive thud. The group of men paused, momentarily distracted by the arrival. From behind the wheel stepped a tall figure in a worn leather jacket, his presence commanding the air around him. It was Sylvester Stallone. His trademark scowl, ever present in the movies, seemed all too real as he scanned the scene. His calm, measured gaze swept across the parking lot, his eyes settling briefly on the Harrisons, then on Rick and his gang. The men at the gas station stood frozen for a split second, their postures stiffening as they recognized the man who had just stepped out of the truck. Rick, still furious, was the first to speak, though his voice faltered a little when he addressed the newcomer. "Hey." Rick sneered, trying to regain his bravado. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna play hero now, too?" Stallone didn't flinch. He simply walked toward the group, his boots echoing in the quiet evening air. His expression remained stoic, but there was something in his eyes that spoke volumes. A quiet warning, the calm before a storm. He didn't rush, but he didn't hesitate either. "Not looking for trouble," Stallone said, his voice low and gravelly. "But I don't like seeing people being pushed around." His eyes shifted from Rick to the rest of the gang, who now stood a little straighter, unsure of how to respond. Rick, trying to save face in front of his crew, stepped forward again, the sneer returning to his lips. "What? You think you could just walk in here and—" "I'm not asking," Stallone interrupted, his voice firm. "But if you want to test it, I'll be happy to show you." The challenge was clear, and in that moment, everything shifted. The group, once brimming with arrogance, now hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. The silence that followed Stallone's words hung heavy in the air, thick with anticipation. The group of men, once brimming with confidence, seemed to waver, their earlier bravado starting to crack. Rick, the leader, still tried to puff himself up, but there was a visible shift in his demeanor. The cocky smirk faded slightly, replaced by a hint of uncertainty. Stallone took another step forward, his presence undeniable, and the effect was immediate. The atmosphere seemed to change, less oppressive, more charged with something new. The evening sun, which had seemed to weigh so heavily moments before, now cast a golden light across his figure, framing him like a character out of a Western. The iconic image of the tough, silent hero had never felt more real. The gang watched as Stallone moved with deliberate ease, every step calculated but effortless. There was no rush in his movements, no need for show. He exuded confidence, not through loud words or flashy gestures, but through the simple power of his presence. His eyes were steady, his posture relaxed yet ready. He didn't need to stand tall or flex his muscles to demand attention. His calm authority spoke volumes. John Harrison, who had been locked in a standoff with Rick, felt the tension ease slightly. He looked over at Lisa and the kids, who were still huddled in the car, and then back at Stallone. The actor's coolness was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded. And for the first time since the confrontation began, John allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Rick took a step back, his earlier cockiness now replaced with hesitation. "What do you want?" he spat, his voice betraying his unease. Stallone's eyes never wavered from the group. He didn't say a word at first. His gaze locked on Rick, and the silence stretched on as if he were deciding just how far he was willing to let this go. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he cracked his neck and spoke, his voice low but cutting through the tension. "I want you to leave. Now." The words landed with the weight of a promise. Stallone stood in the middle of the gas station lot, his eyes scanning the group of men with a sharp, calculated gaze. The others were silent, some still unsure of what to make of his sudden intervention. Rick, despite the hesitation that lingered in his posture, clenched his fists, trying to hold on to whatever pride he had left. The air between them crackled with an energy that had shifted from confrontation to something much more dangerous. Stallone's eyes flicked over each member of the gang, taking in the details. The twitching fingers, the nervous glances exchanged among them, the way they were all on edge now. He didn't move, but every second he remained still seemed to weigh on them more than any words could. His presence alone was enough to unravel the bravado that had initially spurred the group forward. Rick shifted his weight, and the group behind him looked to him for guidance. A couple of the men looked ready to bolt, unsure of where this was headed. The silence stretched long enough to make them question their next move. Stallone wasn't imposing himself. He was simply watching them, waiting. The longer he stood there, the more it became clear that they were the ones on the back foot. John Harrison, still standing near the car, was beginning to understand something. Stallone wasn't just reacting. He was assessing, as calm as the eye of a storm. The older man wasn't just a fighter. He was a strategist, and he knew how to manipulate the situation without ever needing to raise a hand. The gang, once certain they had control of the situation, was now caught in the web of Stallone's quiet authority. Lisa, still in the car with the kids, felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, the looming danger seemed less immediate. As if Stallone had flipped a switch, shifting the balance of power from the gang's aggression to his cold, calculating composure. Rick's eyes flickered nervously, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice cracked. "You're making a mistake, old man." But even he knew, deep down, the mistake had already been made. Rick, still trying to cling to his diminishing bravado, took a half-step forward. His jaw clenched, but there was no mistaking the unease that now radiated from him. His crew watched him, unsure of how to respond to the sudden shift in power. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Rick's eyes darted toward the ground, his mind racing for something, anything, that could get him back in control. Stallone finally broke the stillness, his voice low and calm, yet carrying the weight of authority. "You think you can intimidate people with insults and threats," he said, the words cutting through the tension. "But you're not the only ones who know how to stand your ground." Rick's smirk faltered for a second, but he quickly masked it with another sneer. "Oh, I get it," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you're the hero here, coming to save the day like some movie star." Stallone's gaze never wavered. He stepped closer, not with aggression, but with quiet confidence. "I don't need a script to do what's right," he replied, his words carrying more weight than any punch ever could. "And neither do you." The gang, who had been silently watching the exchange, began to shift uneasily, their earlier confidence slipping further. Rick's hands tightened into fists, but this time he didn't take a step forward. He was on the defensive, and he knew it. "I'm not here to fight you," Stallone continued, his tone still steady, almost detached. "But I will make sure you understand one thing. You don't get to walk into a place like this and harass people just because you can." The message was clear, and Rick, despite himself, hesitated. He glanced at his friends, who looked like they wanted to leave just as much as they wanted to fight. For the first time, Rick wasn't sure whether to push forward or to back away. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. Stallone stood his ground, silent, allowing the weight of his presence to speak for him. Rick stood there for a moment, his fists still clenched, trying to regain his footing. The air between him and Stallone was electric, charged with the tension of a standoff that had now stretched far beyond his expectations. The words from the actor still hung in the air, their weight heavier than the usual bravado Rick was used to throwing around. His eyes flicked to his crew, who stood there like spectators, waiting for him to make a move. But the uncertainty in their gazes was unmistakable. They were looking to him for leadership, but Rick wasn't sure anymore. Stallone, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't push forward, didn't flinch at the taunts, didn't let his body language betray him. His shoulders were relaxed, his stance wide and stable, as though the chaos around him was nothing more than a passing storm. His eyes were sharp, but they never wavered. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone was enough to draw the line in the sand. Rick opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He could feel the weight of Stallone's gaze, like an unspoken challenge. The calmness in the actor's posture was like a mirror reflecting his own disarray. Rick had been used to controlling the room with his anger, his loud words, his need to dominate. But this was different. Stallone wasn't playing by the same rules. The others in the gang shifted, sensing the shift in momentum. One of them, a younger man, looked toward the ground, unwilling to make eye contact with Stallone. Another took a step back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, clearly uncomfortable. Stallone, in his silence, had already won. The heavy silence stretched on, and Rick, for the first time in a long while, found himself on the back foot. The cocky words he'd been preparing seemed to lose their weight. He glanced at the Harrisons, who were still watching from the car, their eyes filled with a quiet hope. The shift in the air was undeniable. Stallone wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. His calm was all the power he needed. Rick's frustration began to build as he watched Stallone stand there, unwavering and calm, a steady presence that seemed to suck the wind out of his own bravado. The gang members behind him shuffled uncomfortably, some with their heads lowered, avoiding the gaze of the man who had stepped in so effortlessly to assert control. The silence between them was like a standoff at the center of a battlefield, but it wasn't the kind of confrontation Rick was used to. Stallone wasn't reacting with anger. He was simply waiting, watching, allowing Rick to make his next move. And that was it. Rick couldn't stand it any longer. With a sharp exhale, Rick squared his shoulders and, with a sudden burst of aggression, moved towards Stallone. "What are you, some kind of tough guy?" He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can walk in here, stare me down, and walk away unscathed?" Stallone didn't flinch. He simply watched Rick approach, his gaze steady, calm, unbothered. There was no sign of fear in his eyes, only the quiet confidence of someone who had been through much worse. Rick wasn't backing down, though. His fists clenched, his face flushed with frustration. "If you think you're so tough, let's see you prove it," he spat, the challenge in his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see if you can actually fight, or if you're just another washed-up actor playing pretend." For a moment, everything froze. The gang held their breath, unsure of what would come next. Even John Harrison, still watching from the car, felt the tension snap tight. Lisa glanced nervously at her children, her grip tightening on the door handle. Stallone remained still, the calm in his eyes unwavering. "You want to make this a fight?" he asked, his voice low but clear. "Fine. But be careful what you wish for." Rick's face twisted with anger, but for the first time, the uncertainty in his eyes was palpable. He had just made a challenge he might not be prepared to face. Rick's challenge hung in the air like a powder keg, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. His chest heaved, his fists tight at his sides, as he waited for Stallone's response. The gang behind him shifted uneasily, eyes flicking between their leader and the calm actor standing across from him. There was no doubt in anyone's mind now. This was more than just a verbal spat. It was escalating toward something bigger. Stallone didn't move, didn't even adjust his stance. His face was a study of calm composure, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "You're not ready for this," he said quietly, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't have a discipline to back it up." Rick sneered, his face reddening with both anger and embarrassment. The crowd of men behind him murmured, a few glancing at each other nervously. They'd all seen their leader try to intimidate people before, but something about Stallone made them hesitate. "Discipline?" Rick laughed, though it sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "I don't need discipline. I just need a shot at you." And with that, Rick lunged. It wasn't calculated or precise. He came at Stallone in a wild, almost desperate charge, throwing fists with no technique behind them, just raw, unrestrained fury. His body moved like a man who hadn't thought through the consequences, just driven by the need to prove something. Stallone didn't move immediately, letting Rick come closer, Then, with a swift motion, he sidestepped. Rick's punch flew by, hitting nothing but air. The actor's reflexes were like that of a man who had spent years dodging real blows. Calm, controlled, precise. Rick stumbled forward with the momentum of his own attack, throwing him off balance. Stallone didn't waste a second. With a quick shift, he grabbed Rick by the arm and spun him, guiding the man's own force into the ground. Rick crashed to the ground with a heavy thud, and the gang gasped. Stallone stood over him, his face still unreadable. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't get to make the rules." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Rick's heavy breathing as he lay, sprawled on the ground, his body tense and disoriented. The gang stood in stunned silence, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of them. Rick's pride had just crumbled, and the realization that they were no longer in control of the situation hit them like a freight train. Some of the men shifted uneasily on their feet, glancing nervously at one another, unsure of how to react. A few had already taken a step back, their shoulders tight with discomfort. The cocky bravado they had carried so confidently into the gas station was rapidly draining away, replaced by a quiet sense of doubt. Rick, still on the ground, pushed himself up slowly, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation. He shot a furious glare at Stallone, but there was no spark of confidence in his eyes anymore, only frustration. The rest of the gang, who had been all too eager to follow his lead moments ago, now seemed to shrink back in a shadow, unsure of what to do next. One of the younger men, a lanky figure with a scruffy beard, finally spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered, looking at the others for support. "This ain't worth it." The other members glanced at him, but no one responded. They all knew it was true, but none of them were willing to be the first to admit it. They had followed Rick into this mess, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of his failure. "Yeah, maybe," another man murmured, his voice uncertain. Rick glared at them, his fists clenched again, but he didn't make a move. The reality of the situation was beginning to set in. They weren't the ones holding the power anymore. Stallone had taken that from them with nothing more than a few words and a swift, effortless motion. The quiet shift in the group's energy was palpable. They weren't sure what to do, but it was clear that Stallone had won, without raising a single fist in anger. The group of tough guys who had once seemed so formidable now looked smaller, uncertain, lost in the shadow of the actor's calm. The silence that followed was deafening. Rick remained on the ground, his pride shattered, his gang frozen in place. Stallone stood tall, calm as ever, his eyes surveying the group with quiet intensity. He wasn't about to back down, but he wasn't going to escalate things either. He didn't need to. His control over the situation was complete. "Get up," Stallone said, his voice low but firm, without a hint of aggression. Rick slowly rose to his feet, his movements sluggish and awkward. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, eyes burning with resentment. But it was clear he was outmatched. Stallone's presence had completely altered the dynamics, and no amount of bravado could change that. Stallone stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the rest of the gang. He didn't need to raise his voice. His calm was more powerful than any shout could be. "You think you can walk around here, causing trouble?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over each member of the group. "You think you can intimidate people, push them around just because you can?" His eyes locked on Rick's, who looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "That's not how it works." The men shifted uncomfortably, unable to hold Stallone's gaze. The actor had effortlessly assumed control, not through force, but through presence, discipline, and an air of quiet authority. They weren't sure what had happened, but the air had changed. They were no longer the ones in charge. Rick's friends looked around at each other, the smugness that had once marked their faces replaced by uncertainty. Some of them began to shuffle back toward their truck, the fight draining from them. Others, still wary, kept their distance from Stallone, unwilling to provoke him further. Stallone turned to the Harrison family, his eyes softening as he gave them a brief, reassuring glance. They were safe. The situation had been defused, not through a violent confrontation, but through something much more powerful, the quiet strength of someone who knew exactly what to do when the moment called for it. "You're free to go," Stallone said, his tone soft yet commanding, as if this moment of victory was just another day's work for him. And with that, the control he'd taken over the situation remained firm and unchallenged. Rick stood there, his body stiff with frustration, his chest heaving as he tried to gather whatever pride he had left. The gang had begun to disperse, a few members already retreating toward the trucks, eyes averted from Stallone. But Rick wasn't ready to back down, not yet. His face twisted with a mix of anger and humiliation, his mind racing with the sting of defeat. He couldn't just walk away like this, not after being so thoroughly outclassed. "You think you've won?" Rick's voice came out hoarse, tinged with desperation. "This isn't over, old man. You're nothing but a washed-up actor who—" Stallone didn't flinch. He kept his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, but there was no sign of emotion. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. People who couldn't accept their defeat, people who couldn't let go of their own arrogance. Rick's hands were shaking now, but he clenched them into fists again, trying to steady himself. "You think this is over?" he repeated, his words louder now, trying to assert dominance he no longer had. "I'll make sure you regret this." The group had stopped moving, watching with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. They knew Rick's words were empty, but they also knew what he was capable of. Stallone, however, wasn't intimidated. "You've already lost," Stallone said, his voice steady but unyielding. "You don't get to dictate how this ends." Rick's eyes flicked toward his gang, searching for validation, but none of them offered him anything. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced with doubt. They had seen enough. They were done. Rick, feeling the last shred of his control slip away, took a step forward, his movements jerky, almost reckless. He raised his fist, but there was no real force behind it. It was a final, desperate attempt to hold on to the power he thought he had, an act that was as futile as it was misguided. Before he could fully extend his arm, Stallone moved. He caught Rick's wrist with one hand, stopping the motion with ease. "It's over," he said again, and this time, the words carried an undeniable finality. Rick stood frozen for a moment, his body tense with rage, but there was no fight left in him. He had lost, and he knew it. Rick's arm trembled in Stallone's grip, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. The desperation that had fueled his actions moments ago had now given way to a cold, uncomfortable realization. He wasn't in control anymore. His body remained stiff, but his resolve was crumbling, as though the ground beneath him had been swept away. Stallone didn't apply pressure, didn't twist Rick's arm or raise a fist. He simply held him there, his calm demeanor never faltering. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive, the air almost vibrating with the tension. Rick's chest heaved with shallow breaths, his pride and arrogance fighting to resurface, but they felt weaker now, like a sinking ship. "You're done," Stallone said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. He wasn't looking for a fight anymore. He had already won it. His words were final, the truth undeniable. Rick's eyes darted around, his gaze flickering between Stallone's unwavering face and his own gang, who stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Not a single person moved to help him. They all stood in the shadow of Stallone's control, the realization that they were all complicit in this mess weighing on them. They had followed Rick blindly, but now they saw their leader for what he really was, someone too small to stand up to real strength. "Let go of me," Rick spat, but his voice lacked conviction. There was no fire left in it, only a dull ember of frustration. Stallone's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't release him just yet. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You want to walk away from this with your dignity intact. You'll listen," he said. "Go back to your truck, and you leave these people alone. That's the only way out of this." For a long moment, Rick said nothing. His face was flushed with anger, but it wasn't the same. It was hollow now, stripped of the arrogance that had driven him earlier. Slowly, he lowered his head, a silent surrender, and Stallone let go. The moment of truth had come, and Rick knew he had no choice but to accept it. Rick stood there, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt small. The anger that had burned in him only moments before now seemed like an illusion, a fleeting burst of fire that had been extinguished with one simple act of calm. His pride, the one thing he had relied on all these years, was gone, and in its place was the crushing realization of his own vulnerability. Stallone stepped back, giving Rick space, but the control never left him. The actor's presence was like a wall, unmovable and solid. Rick's gaze flickered to his gang, but no one looked back at him with any kind of support. They weren't just avoiding his eyes, they were retreating. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't just the weight of the confrontation anymore. It was the collective realization that Rick's reign was over. "Go ahead," Stallone said softly, his tone still steady but carrying an unspoken challenge. "Walk away now. No one's stopping you." For a moment, it looked like Rick might refuse, might lash out one last time in defiance. But as his eyes met the faces of the men he'd once commanded, something shifted inside him. They weren't looking at him the same way. They were looking at Stallone. They were watching him. And for the first time, Rick realized they were no longer interested in his brand of dominance. Rick's fists loosened, and with a visible exhale, he looked down, defeated. Slowly, he turned, not in anger, but in surrender, and started to walk toward his truck. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel was the only noise breaking the stillness. The others followed behind him, a few muttering to each other, but no one dared to approach Stallone. John Harrison, watching from the car, let out a quiet breath. He exchanged a glance with Lisa, who was still holding on to the kids, but this time there was a sense of relief in their eyes. The turning point had come. The threat was gone, and it had never been about violence. It had been about something much stronger, the quiet, unwavering power of control and resolve. Rick's boots crunched sharply against the gravel as he walked toward the truck, each step heavy with the weight of his humiliation. His pride, once a force he wielded like a weapon, was now a crumpled shell that weighed him down more than the dirt beneath his feet. He could feel the eyes of his gang on him, their gaze no longer filled with respect or admiration, but pity, discomfort, and something else, disappointment. The very thing he had fought so hard to avoid. As he reached the truck, his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the door handle. He could hear the faint murmurs of his men behind him, but their words were lost in the rush of blood in his ears. The truck door creaked as he pulled it open, and he slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather feeling like a strange comfort. He could still taste the bitterness of defeat on his tongue. Rick looked in the rearview mirror, trying to catch his breath, but all he saw was the reflection of someone who had lost everything. He had walked into this gas station a man with a purpose, a man with a plan. Now, he was nothing more than a hollow shell. The men who had followed him, who had cheered him on, were now scattering, unsure of what to do or where to go. The silence in the lot was deafening. His crew, the very people who had once stood behind him no matter the fight, were distancing themselves. He slammed the door shut, but the sound was muffled, as if even the truck itself had no interest in amplifying his anger anymore. He leaned back in his seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, as if trying to hold onto the last shred of control he had left. Rick's eyes narrowed, but no amount of defiance could mask the truth. The humiliation was not just in losing the confrontation. It was in knowing that, despite all his effort, he had lost something far more valuable, the respect of those around him. And that was something he could never get back. John Harrison watched as Rick and his gang retreated toward their trucks, their postures slumped and defeated. The tension in the air had dissipated, but the weight of the encounter lingered. He turned his attention to Lisa, who was still sitting in the car, her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Emily and James sat in the back seat, wide-eyed and silent. The entire family had been witnesses to the chaos, and though the immediate danger was gone, the lingering effects were not easily erased. "Are we going to keep going?" Lisa asked quietly, her voice tight with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She didn't want to seem weak or shaken, but the events had clearly rattled her more than she cared to admit. John glanced at the gas station, his mind racing. They had planned to take this trip to relax, to escape the noise and stress of daily life. Yet, the peaceful stop had quickly spiraled into a dangerous encounter. He could still feel the adrenaline in his veins, but now that the danger had passed, there was a part of him that felt a deep sense of gratitude for Stallone's timely intervention, for his family's safety, but also an unsettling feeling that it wasn't over. "We can go," John said, his voice steady, though he still weighed the decision in his mind. "But I don't know if I want to keep driving without thinking about it. We need to talk." Lisa looked at him, her expression softening. "I know. I'm just glad it's over." John looked over his shoulder at the kids. Emily's eyes were wide, but James looked strangely calm. Maybe too calm. He could tell that this experience had left its mark, especially on them. John had been ready to move on, to let the moment pass and push forward. But now he wasn't so sure. "We'll keep going, but we'll make a stop soon," John said, his voice firm but gentle. "We need to make sure we're all okay." Lisa nodded, her eyes searching his face. "We're fine," she whispered, though both of them knew the unease still lingered. The truck engines sputtered to life one by one, their low growls reverberating through the quiet gas station. But this time, the noise was different, grating, uncertain, like a wave of defeat crashing against a once strong shore. The men who had once followed Rick without question were now scattered, not out of fear, but out of collective, uneasy realization that their loyalty had been misplaced. Rick had lost control, not just of the situation, but of everything he had built. The gang, which had once been united in their aggression, now stood divided. One by one, they climbed into their trucks, avoiding eye contact with each other, with Rick. The silence among them spoke volumes. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but it was clear that the bond that had held them together was unraveling. The youngest member, a man in his late 20s with a scruffy beard, was the first to break the silence. He turned to the others, his voice hesitant. "We're just going to keep following him like this? You saw what happened. That guy, Stallone, he wasn't just talking. He put us in our place. I don't know about you, but I'm done with this." His words hung in the air, heavier than the sound of the engines. The older man, sitting in the passenger seat of the truck next to him, shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, we got what we deserved," he muttered, his voice low, his tone reflective. "Rick's been taking us down the wrong road for too long." Rick, still sitting in his truck, his hands clenched on the steering wheel, could hear the murmurs from the others. It wasn't the words that stung. It was the tone, the way they no longer saw him as their leader, the way they no longer followed him with the same blind confidence. "Where are you going?" Rick called out, but his voice was weak, lacking the force it had carried earlier. The youngest member didn't even look back. "Home," he replied, the word final. One by one, the others followed suit, driving off in different directions, each one leaving Rick behind. And just like that, the gang disbanded. Rick was alone. Rick sat in his truck, the engine running, but his hands felt numb on the wheel. The emptiness in the parking lot was suffocating, the stillness more deafening than any noise could be. He watched the last of his crew drive off, one by one, leaving him in the dust. Each departure was like another nail in the coffin of his pride, his leadership, and his identity. The reality of it hit him hard. He was no longer in control, not of the situation, and certainly not of his life. The familiar roar of Stallone's truck broke the silence. Rick flinched, his hands gripping the wheel tighter, the burn of humiliation still stinging. Stallone's truck rolled into the space next to Rick's, the engine turning off with a definitive click. The door opened with a slow creak, and the figure of the actor emerged, stepping out of the truck with the same quiet confidence he had carried all along. Rick didn't move, didn't speak, though every part of him screamed to lash out, to reclaim some sliver of the power he had lost. But something in Stallone's eyes held him back. There was no anger in the actor's gaze, no mockery. Just calm, unwavering resolve. "You know," Stallone began, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "this could have been avoided. But you pushed it too far." Rick didn't answer. He couldn't. Stallone took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in its quiet authority. "You've got a choice, Rick," he said, his words firm but not unkind. You walk away now, and you learn from this. Or you keep going down the same path, and you end up just like your crew, alone, broken, and irrelevant. Rick's eyes flickered with a flash of defiance, but deep down, he knew it was true. He had already lost. The choice Stallone laid out for him was clear. But at that moment, Rick wasn't sure he was strong enough to walk away. Still, for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Maybe Stallone was right. Maybe it was time to let go. Rick sat in his truck, staring at the road ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The words Stallone had spoken still echoed in his mind, cutting through the haze of his anger and humiliation. There was no denying it now. He had been outmatched, outplayed, and worse, he had lost not just a fight, but his sense of control. But there was still one thing he could salvage: his dignity. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the tension between what he had been and what he could become. He knew he could keep fighting, keep pushing, but at what cost? His eyes flicked toward the empty parking lot, the echoes of his past mistakes ringing in his ears. The rest of his crew was gone, their departure a silent verdict he couldn't ignore. Stallone hadn't said anything more after the warning, and Rick hadn't answered. The actor had simply given him space to think, space to make a choice. And now, the choice was his. With a deep breath, Rick turned the key, the engine humming to life. For a moment, he sat there, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. He could drive away, disappear into the distance like his crew had, or he could do something that had never come easily to him: walk away with grace. Walk away before he became the man he'd always feared he would be. Someone who couldn't let go, someone consumed by pride and bitterness. Rick shifted the truck into drive and slowly pulled out of the gas station lot, taking one last look at the place where his gang had once stood, where he had once been in charge. The road stretched out before him, open and waiting. The road wasn't just a path to somewhere new. It was a path to something he had never considered before: a second chance. As the gas station grew smaller in his rearview mirror, Rick didn't look back. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, amber glow across the gas station. The air was still, the chaos of the past few hours slowly fading into the background.